We play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another How to Play Warhammer 40k 9th edition video. We're going to go over the rest of the turn now. In our previous video we covered command phase, movement phase, psychic phase. Now we're going to get into the dice rolling, which is the shooting phase, charge phase, and fight phase. And we'll also cover the morale phase just for completion. So this will get you through the rest of the player turn. We got a lot to cover here. There's going to be a lot of information. So if you feel overloaded by the end, don't worry. We've created another special battle report just for this video that is at a link in the description below in the MiniWarGaming Vault that'll show you a very practiced and well-explained battle report where we'll walk you through everything so you can see how it works practically, not just in theory or in examples. So watch this video and go check that out. If you're not a Vault member, you can still click it and get a free 7-day trial to try it out. Vault members are what support us and allow us to do all of this, so please consider joining today. Let's jump right into it and take a look at how you can make attacks. Making attacks. Before we get into the shooting, charge, and fight phases, there's something important that you have to understand how it works, and that is how to make attacks. The rules for making attacks are pretty much identical for shooting and close combat, once you've chosen your target. Obviously, shooting attacks fire at a distance, so your target has to be in range, whereas close combat attacks in the fight phase, you need to be nice and close up. We'll cover those in the shooting phases and the fight phase respectively, but right now, if you're making an attack against somebody, let's see exactly how it works. Let's look at the example of this Blade Guard veteran squad and this Gene Stealer squad who are in this ongoing combat. We're not going to worry about who's charged or any other things like that. We just want to know what an attack looks like. So when we go to make an attack, whether close combat or shooting, the first thing we have to do is make a hit roll. And so we're going to assume that you're going to make every single attack roll one die at a time. So if you had 5 attacks, you could just roll the 5 dice together, assuming they all were the same types of attacks. But right here, just for the demonstration, we're going to do these one at a time. So the first thing we have to do, let's assume that the Blade Guard veteran are the ones who are currently attacking. So we're going to roll one of their attacks. Since this is close combat, we're going to specifically look at the weapon skill of the Blade Guard veteran squad, which, as you can see on this data sheet, is a 3+. If they were shooting, we would instead look at the ballistic skill, which in this case is also 3+, but it might actually be different. What we have to do is first make a hit roll. This is done by taking a d6, a 6-sided die, and rolling it. And this is a 6, remember. If we get equal to or greater than the weapon skill or ballistic skill that we are trying to get, then it is a successful hit. If it's not a successful hit, we stop there, we don't go any further, it was a miss. Now I should talk for a moment about rerolls. There are rules that let you reroll. A reroll is just what it sounds like. It lets you pick up the die and roll it again. For example, if I rolled a 1 or a 2 and I missed and I wanted to do a reroll through whatever method possible, then I can pick it up and just roll it again. Now, I should say that you can't just do rerolls. There will be cases that let you do rerolls, but you can never reroll a reroll. So if you have 2 separate rules allowing a reroll, you can only use one of them. In other words, once you've rerolled, you're stuck. Also, there may be modifiers to your dice rolls. For example, maybe the Gene Stealers have a special rule on them from a psychic power that makes it so they're shrouded and they're harder to hit. And so you get a -1 to your dice rolls. So for example, if I did roll a 3, well, that 3 would become a 2, and it is now a miss. If there are multiple modifiers, like I had a -1 there, and maybe then the Blade Guard veteran were suffering from some sort of psychic power that gave them -1, then you might think, well, that's going to be -2 to the hit roll. But a hit roll can never be modified by more than 1, either positively or negatively. Once we've done our hit roll, we go on to the wound roll. This is where we compare the strength versus the toughness. So we look at this datasheet of the Blade Guard veteran squad. You can see that their strength is 4. However, we're going to look specifically at the weapon they're using, which is a master crafted power sword, which has a strength of +1. So this is added to the strength characteristic of the unit, so it's actually going to be at strength 5. We then compare the strength to the toughness of the target. If we look at the Gene Stealer datasheet right here, you see that their toughness 4. Since my strength is higher than the toughness, then we compare this to a chart that is in the rulebook that shows the strength versus toughness. If the strength is equal to the toughness, then you have to roll a 4 or higher to wound. If it's greater than, which is the case of this Blade Guard veteran versus the Gene Stealer, then we have to roll a 3 or higher. If it's more than twice or more, I should say, than the enemy toughness, then you only need a 2. and so on and so forth. For example, if their toughness is twice your strength, then you're going to need a 6. So just refer to this chart, but it's pretty easy to remember. If they're equal, it's on 4s. Otherwise, it'll be one of the other ones there. So we're strength 5 versus toughness 4, so I'm going to have to roll a 3 to wound. If there were modifiers to this, it follows the same rules that you can't have more than +1 or -2 or -1 to these modifiers. So I have to roll 3+, and I roll a 4 and succeed. Now, it should be noted that an unmodified 1 is always a failure for hit rolls and wound rolls. And an unmodified 6 is always a success for hit rolls or wound rolls. So if somehow you really sucked at close combat and you had a weapon skill of 6+, in other words, you had to roll a 6, but your opponent gave you -1, well, that becomes impossible. You can't roll a 6 when you're getting -1. But unmodified 6s always succeed, and unmodified 1s always fail. Assuming we have now wounded, the player who controls the target unit, so the player in control of the Gene Stealers, gets to allocate that wound to one of the models. So they would pick one of the Gene Stealers that they would then put the wound on. They have to pick a model that's already injured or that has already been picked this phase. If nobody's been picked, well, then they can choose whatever they want. We then move into a saving throw. So a saving throw would be looking at the save characteristic of the squad. If we look at the Gene Stealers, you see they have a saving characteristic of 5+. So they would have to roll 5 or higher to stop this wound from hurting them. However, this gets modified by the armor penetration of the weapon that is attacking. If we go back to the Blade Guard Veteran Squad datasheet, we see that a Mastercrafted Power Sword has an AP value of -3. That means that this will subtract 3 from my armor save roll. Now, saving throws don't have the same restriction that hit and wound rolls. They can be modified by more than 1. And a 6 is never an automatic success, although an unmodified 1 is always a failure. So in other words, a 5+ save becomes impossible. And that is okay, and that is intended. However, we have some other things special. It's called an invulnerable save, which these Gene Stealers happen to have because they're super fast and dodgy. An invulnerable save is a saving throw that cannot be modified. You can't choose to do an invulnerable save and a saving throw. You've got to choose one or the other. So these Gene Stealers have a 5+ invulnerable save. So no matter what the armor penetration is, I still get to roll it. And in this case, I roll a 3 and I fail. Once I fail that, we move on to the final step, which is inflicting damage. Now, we've already chosen a model. Let's say it was the one out front. And we now inflict the damage of the weapon. So this goes back to the weapon profile, which right here you can see the Mastercrafted Power Sword has a damage value of 2. So it will inflict 2 wounds on the Gene Stealer that I just pointed out. Now, Gene Stealers only have 1 wound, and so this will just kill the Gene Stealer. And that extra wound does not spill over to the next model, so it's just lost. If these Gene Stealers had 3 wounds each, for example, then that 2 damage would have brought one of them down to 1 wound, and then we would continue with the rest of our attacks. Now, seeing as how we have a lot of attacks from these Blade Guard veterans, and they're all the same weapon skill, and they're all the same strength and AP and damage, we could do what's called fast dice rolling and just roll them all at the same time. For example, if we go back to the Blade Guard Veteran Squad, we see they have 3 attacks on each of them, and the Sergeant has 4. That would give us a total of 10 attacks, 3 + 3 + 4. So we could just take 10 dice and roll them all at the same time. But this only works if they're all the same weapon skill, the same strength, the same armor penetration, and the same damage. Otherwise, you don't know which one actually got through. Mortal wounds. Some attacks inflict what are called mortal wounds. We briefly touched on these when we talked about the psychic phase in our last video. A mortal wound is simply an attack that ignores all of the rules we just told you. You don't make a hit roll, you don't make a wound roll, and you don't get a saving throw, even in vulnerable saves against it. So if an attack does, for example, 1 mortal wound, then we would jump straight to the allocating attacks and inflicting damage. So let's say that this blade, which it doesn't, but let's just say when it attacks on a hit, it does 1 mortal wound. So then we would roll the hit, in this case, and if we hit, then we would not roll to wound, and we would not get a saving throw, and we would just inflict that wound straight to the model. Sometimes you have to roll the hit to do a mortal wound. Sometimes you have to roll a specific number to do a mortal wound. Just refer to whatever the rules are on your data sheets. Ignoring wounds. Lastly, for making attacks, some models have abilities that allow them to ignore wounds. For example, for these Gene Stealers, let's say that they had the Psychic Power Catalyst manifested for them, which means they ignore wounds and mortal wounds on a 5+. This adds one final step to the whole process. After we've allocated damage, we then roll to see if we ignore those wounds. If you have more than one source that lets you ignore wounds, you can only use one of them, kind of like saving throws. So let's assume that we've gone through the whole process with one attack with these Blade Guard Veteran. They hit, they wounded, I failed my invulnerable save, I've allocated now to this model. We look at it, it's done 2 damage. So I would take 2 dice and I ignore each of that damage on a 5+. So if I roll a 6 and a 4, well, the 6 ignores it, but the 4 doesn't, and the model dies anyways. If the model had 2 wounds, then he would have just saved himself dying because he'd have 1 wound left. If I had managed to roll 2 5+, a 6 and a 5, I would have ignored the damage completely. Shooting phase. Now that we understand how attacks are made, we can apply that knowledge to both the shooting phase and the fight phase. Let's start with the shooting phase. So here is where we're going to select units that have ranged weapons that are in range to fire and fire at our enemies. Let's take a look at an example. In this example, it is the Necron player's turn. We have a unit of 5 Necron warriors armed with Gauss Reapers who are ready to shoot. So first we select the unit we want to shoot with. In this case, we've only got 1, so we'll select the Necron warriors. The second thing we do is make sure they're not locked in combat, because if they are in engagement range of the enemy, they're not allowed to shoot. Also, they can't shoot if they fell back or if they advanced, unless they're firing an assault weapon, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Next, we figure out how many attacks they get to make. Now this is where it can get a little more complicated, because we need to look at the profile of the weapon. Right here you can see the Necron Warriors datasheet, and the profile of a Gauss Reaper is that it has a range of 14 inches, so obviously the enemy needs to be in range. It has type Rapid Fire 1, which we'll talk about in a moment. It has a strength of 5, an AP armor penetration of -2, and a damage of 1. You'll notice that ranged weapons typically have a set strength, like 4 or 6 or 3, whereas close combat weapons will usually have a strength modifier that'll say either user or +1 or +2 or ×2. So now we have to figure out how we want to fire these Gauss Reapers. Now the type of weapon is going to help you determine how many shots the weapons get to make. We have a few different types. We have assault, heavy, rapid fire, grenade, and pistol. Rapid fire weapons have a rule that says if you are within half the range of their weapon, then they can fire twice. So the first part that says rapid fire, that tells you the type. The number afterwards tells you how many attacks it normally would get. If we look at these models, the first thing we have to do is check range. And this is model by model. So this model at the back is definitely within 14 inches, and obviously so are the models out front. However, which ones are in half range? Well, let's measure 7 inches from this model, and we see that 2 of the Necron Warriors are in half range. So those specific models get to fire twice. So the 3 models in the back each have 1 attack, as it says rapid fire 1, and each model out front gets 2 attacks for a total of 7 attacks. Now the rules do assume that you're doing these one at a time, but there's really no reason to if they are all coming from the same weapon onto the same unit. It should be noted, however, that you do need to have line of sight, visibility to the unit that you are firing at. Then we go through our process, which I'm not going to really hang up on because we've already gone through it in such detail, of making our attacks. Let's do it really quickly here. Necron Warriors have a ballistic skill of 3+. So we take our dice and we roll. How many 3+s did we get? Remember, 1s automatically fail and 6s automatically pass. Well, we've actually got a really good roll here and only 1 failed. So we're just going to pull that die away. Next, we compare the strength of the weapon to the toughness of the enemy. Strength 5 versus toughness 4 means we need 3s to wound. Once again, you'll get really fast at this once you've done it a few times. So we roll again and roll kind of poorly, getting 3 2s, which are not wounding rolls. So we take those out of the mix. Your opponent then gets to allocate those attacks. Let's just say he's going to allocate to the ones in the back, because he wants to stay as close to you as possible, because he wants to charge in with those mighty Astartes chainswords. Once he's allocated, he does his saving throws. He looks at his save characteristic, which is 3+, compares it to the armor penetration of your weapon. In this case, the Gauss Reaper is -2. So an easy way to just do it is to take your 3+ save and then modify it by 2 worse. So 3+ becomes 5+. Rather than thinking about your dice rolls modifying down, it's much easier this way. So 3+ save with a -2 armor penetration becomes 5+. I know -2 making the number higher is kind of weird, but that's worsening your save. So we roll 3 dice, and we roll a 6, which obviously passes, and 2 2s, which fail. So now we've allocated the damage to this model first. we then have to allocate the damage. Now the damage of the Gauss Reaper is just 1, so each of these failed saves is 1 damage. Well, one of these models has 2 wounds, and so those 2 wounds are allocated to him, and he is removed because he died. And that is it. That's all the shooting that happens for these models. Other types of weapons. Most of the other weapon types are pretty straightforward. For example, this Plasmancer here has a plasmic lance. When shot, has a type of assault D3. This means that it's an assault weapon, which means he can advance and still fire it, but he gets a -1 to his hit rolls. The D3 means we have to roll how many shots he gets to make with it, so it's a random number of shots. So we would roll first and say, well, that's a 2, because remember we divide it by 2 rounding up, and he gets to make 2 shots with it. Heavy weapons, such as this missile launcher on this Tactical Marine, have a penalty for infantry models if they have moved in their previous movement phase. So anything except remain stationary, they get a -1 to shoot it. Pistols, such as those that are armed on these assault intercessors, are pretty much like any other weapon. They just fire as usual using the normal rules, except that they can actually be used to fire while they are in engagement range with an enemy, as long as they fire at the enemy that they are engaged with. So essentially, you can fire them into the combat that you are already participating in. Lastly, grenades, and we have grenades on these assault intercessors, are weapons that one model can choose to use in a unit per shooting phase. You could have multiple units use grenades, but each unit only one model can throw one. And when he uses that grenade, he can't fire any other weapons. Big guns never tire. Vehicles and monsters are still allowed to shoot all of their weapons, even if they are in engagement range, but they can only fire at models or units that they are already in engagement range with. The only types of weapons they're not allowed to fire are blast weapons. So in other words, weapons that have blast as one of their abilities. Other than that, they can fire them. If the weapon is a heavy weapon, they do get a -1 to shoot into close combat. You're even allowed to say, you know what, these last cannons will fire at the warriors and the heavy bolter will fire at the Plasmancer, but then the storm bolter is going to fire at another unit outside of combat. You could even say all that. The thing is, you have to resolve all of the attacks in combat first, and if there's still something that is within your engagement range, you won't be able to fire the one that you declared at a target outside of that engagement range. Look out, sir! If a character, such as this Plasmancer, that has 9 wounds or less, is within 3 inches of a unit that has 3 or more models, or is a vehicle or monster, he cannot be targeted by shooting attacks unless he is the closest enemy unit. In other words, you couldn't fire at this Plasmancer with this unit of assault intercessors unless he was out front. In this case, he's still within 3 inches, but now he is the closest model. This is meant to protect characters. You can ignore other characters when deciding who is the closest, and also characters that have 10 or more wounds don't get this protection. Blast weapons. Some weapons or partial weapons have the blast ability. For example, this Tactical Marine on the left has a missile launcher. He can fire it as a crack missile, which is just a single shot, high strength, or he can fire it as a frag missile, which is a blast, which is heavy D6. In other words, it gets D6 shots. I would roll a die and I would get that many shots. So let's say I rolled that 3. Now the difference with the blast weapons, if it has the blast ability, then if you look at the number of models in the unit you're firing at, and there's at least 6 models, it will always get a minimum of 3 shots. So let's say I did roll a 2. Well, then it would count as a 3. So a 1 or a 2 count as 3, whereas 4, 5, and 6 would just be whatever they are. If the unit actually has 11 or more, you automatically get your maximum number of shots, as the blast is super effective against large hordes. And just a reminder, blast weapons can never be used in engagement range by vehicles and monsters. Charge phase. The charge phase is the phase where you're allowed to, well, charge. You're allowed to move your models into engagement range of the enemy. There are some restrictions, and there's a way that you do it, which we're going to cover right here. And we'll also talk about heroic interventions. Charges. In the charge phase, you can go one by one through units who are eligible to charge, and they're eligible to charge if they're within 12 inches of an enemy unit, at least one, and they didn't fall back and they didn't advance, assuming they didn't have any other abilities that allowed them to do so. And then you just try to get into combat. The way you do this is you first have to declare the charge. So let's say it's a Space Marine turn. We have these assault intercessors who are eager to get into combat with these Necron warriors. They have to declare who they are charging. And they have to declare more than one unit if their intent is to get into engagement range of more than one unit. So if they want to fight the Plasmancer back here, who is a separate unit, they would need to declare that they're charging the Necron Warriors and the Plasmancer. Now they could just declare the Plasmancer, but it means that when they make their charge move, they have to stay out of engagement range of the Necron Warriors. It's also important to note that in the fight phase, which is next, if you charged, you can only fight things that you declared charges against, unless they heroically intervened, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Once we have made our selection of what they're going to charge, we do a charge roll. This is simply a 2d6, or roll 2 dice and add them together. And let's say we rolled a 6 here. Now, in order for the charge to be successful, that unit must be able to move that distance, in this case 6 inches, and end in unit coherency and in engagement range of every target they declared a charge against. So if I did declare a charge against both the Necron Warriors and the Plasmancer, that 6 inches would not get me in engagement range of the Plasmancer, and I wouldn't be able to move at all. If I had just declared the charge against the Necron Warriors, then we're good. I just move each model however I want, as long as I move only 6 inches or less, and the models end in coherency, and at least one of them ended in engagement range of the enemy. Now, before those models moved, the opponent has the option to do what's called Overwatch. Now, this costs 1 command point and is a stratagem which we haven't covered yet, but it simply is an out-of-sequence shooting attack that they get to do, but they only hit on 6s. So let's say the Necron Warriors did decide they wanted to Overwatch. They spend the 1 command point on a stratagem. Then they just get to fire as if it was their shooting phase, except they count pretty much their ballistic skill as a 6+. So they would still get, in this case, their 20 shots, because there's 10 of them in rapid fire range, but they'd only hit on 6s. Everything else is resolved the same though. The wounding, save rolls, allocating damage. If the unit survives the Overwatch, then they would roll their charge distance and hopefully then go in to fight. Heroic interventions. Once all the charge moves are complete, the enemy player, in other words, the player whose turn it is not, can opt to do what are called heroic interventions. A character is allowed to do a heroic intervention if at the end of the enemy's charge phase, it is within 3 inches of an enemy unit. In other words, we look at this Plasmancer, he's within 3 inches of the Assault Intercessors, and he could choose to heroically intervene. A heroic intervention is simply up to a 3-inch move that does not actually have to finish in engagement range of the enemy, but must finish at closer than where it started. So I couldn't use the 3 inches to go this way, for example. I'd have to end closer, but I don't have to come to engagement. I could use to go a little laterally. Maybe it'll help me grab an objective. Usually it's used to get you into close combat as well. You need to be warned though, like I said before, the units that have charged can only choose units that they charged against as their targets, unless you heroically intervene, in which case they can also fight that unit. Fight phase. The fight phase, like the shooting phase, is where all of the attacks happen. Well, the charge phase is how you got into close combat. The fight phase is where you actually resolve the effects of those fights. And regardless or not of whether you've charged, if any units are in engagement range of other units, then there are fights to be had. It should be noted that any units that charged always get to go first. So if you charge 2 units into close combat, then you get to actually activate those units before your opponent gets to do anything. Once all charging units have gone, then your opponent, the person whose turn it is not, is the one who gets to select a unit that is in engagement range of one of your units and fight with that. Then you get to select a unit that is in engagement range with your opponent and fight with that. It should be noted that you can never select the same unit more than once to fight, even if they charged, unless they have a special rule that allows that, which most units do not. Once you've gone back and forth with all this, then you can proceed to the morale phase. Let's take a look at an example. If we go back to our previous charge phase where these Assault Intercessors charge, and then now come to the fight phase, the first thing we resolve, of course, is the charging unit. So these Assault Intercessors get to go first. Now, when you're selected to fight, before you fight, you actually get to do what's called a pile-in move. A pile-in move is simply where you move each model in the unit up to 3 inches, but each model must end closer to the closest enemy model. So for example, this guy right here, he's just a hair away from this Necron Warrior. So if he wants to move 3 inches, he could go all the way over here, but he'll need to make sure his base touches that Necron Warrior so that he has ended up closer. Remember, just like every other move, you need to make sure you maintain unit coherency. And if you can't, then you can't do that move. So we can move these around as much as we want just to make sure that most of them get into combat. Then we make our close combat attacks. Now in the shooting phase, we looked at the range of the weapon to determine if we were allowed to fight. Well, it's a little different in close combat. You can fight with a model, remember not unit, but a model, if he's in engagement range of the enemy. Or if he's within half an inch of another model from that same unit who is also within half an inch of an enemy. So let's give some examples here. We have these 4 models who are all in engagement range of enemy models. If we had this model right here, he is not currently in engagement range. He's not within an inch of an enemy model, but he is within half an inch of a model who is within half an inch of the Necron warriors, so he is eligible to fight as well. We then look at the number of attacks they have and their attack profile. If you look at the assault intercessors, you see they have 2 attacks each, and the sergeant has 3. We roll that many attacks for hits and wounds. We allocate them just like shooting attacks. They act identical to it, and your opponent then allocates them, rolls their saves, and removes any casualties. Fighting on multiple levels. Fighting on multiple levels can look a little confusing at first until you just apply the same logic as to who can fight. Let's look at this example right here. Let's assume that the assault intercessors have already piled in, so they can't move any further, and now they have to fight. So who can fight? Well, it's pretty obvious for the 3 models on the ground floor that they're in engagement range of the Necron warriors. But what about the 2 in the next level up? Well, I'll tell you right now, these levels are 5 inches apart, just so that you can just eyeball it and know what's going on here. This assault intercessor is directly above the Necron warriors, so he's obviously in engagement range because he's within 5 inches vertically and 1 inch horizontally. So he is allowed to fight. This assault intercessor, although he is in coherency with his own unit, he's not within an inch horizontally of the Necron warriors, even though he is in 5 inches vertically. So he would not be allowed to fight. If we had shifted this one assault intercessor back, so he's just barely within an inch and 5 inches vertically of the Necron warriors, he could still fight. But this assault intercessor still could not, even though he's within half an inch of a model who can fight. Remember, he has to be within half an inch of a model who's within half an inch of the enemy, which is obviously not what that model up top is able to do. If this seems confusing, it doesn't come up too often, but just make sure you go through those steps. Are they in engagement range? Yes, he can fight. No. Are they within half an inch of a model who's within half an inch of an enemy? Yes, they can fight. No, they cannot. Consolidation. Let's simulate a fight here. Let's say these 5 assault intercessors charge into these Necron warriors and kill 5 of them. And the Necron warriors player decides to remove these 5. After the fight is complete, the assault intercessors can do what's called a consolidation move. This works identically to a pylon move, where each model can move up to 3 inches as long as they remain in unit coherency, or at least finish in unit coherency, and as long as each model ends closer to the closest enemy model. So we could use this basically to close the gap. For the most part, it looks pretty natural. They all just move in closer, but there are some shenanigans you can do with this to maybe grab objectives or to keep other enemies from fighting or to pull other enemies into combat. When you're doing pylons and consolidations, you are actually allowed to move into engagement range of units that you weren't already in engagement range with. Just be careful, because if you do that and that unit hasn't fought yet, they can fight you. So they might be able to do some damage to you before the fight phase is over. Morale phase. The morale phase is where we test the mettle of our units. We check to see those units who have suffered casualties this turn, if any more of their models are going to run away or be destroyed. We do this by alternating, starting with the player whose turn it is, picking units who have suffered casualties this turn. Only count the casualties from this turn, not previous turns. We then roll a die, add those casualties, and we see if they pass. Let's take a look. Coming back to our example of this fight, let's assume that we've lost 5 Necron warriors. Let's say though they retaliated and got lucky and killed 3 of our assault intercessors, leaving only the sergeant and 1 other alive. Well, now we have to test for morale. All the fights are done. Let's see who is going to stick around. Since it's a Space Marine player's turn, we start with them. So they pick the assault intercessor squad. We then look at its data sheet, which you can see here, and we look for its leadership. Now we'll actually find 2 numbers here. We'll find a leadership of 7 for an assault intercessor and 8 for the sergeant. We use the highest leadership of the group. In other words, the sergeant is boosting the morale of his group. We then come back, we take a d6, we roll it, we add the number of casualties, in this case 3, and we compare that to the leadership. Did it exceed the leadership? And in this case, we rolled a 6, we add 3, that becomes 9, and 9 does exceed 8. So that unit of assault intercessors failed their morale test. Now, Space Marines have a rule that lets them re-roll if they failed, but let's pretend for a moment that they don't. What happens next? Well, we do what's called combat attrition. So the first thing that happens is one model of the player's choosing, my player, like the Space Marine player, first just removes a model. That model ran away, got overrun, however you want to look at it thematically. You then roll a die for each remaining model in the unit. For every 1 that you roll, a model is also removed. However, if the unit is at less than half its starting strength, then it will die on 1s or 2s. So for example, these assault intercessors started with 5 models. Well, 1 model remaining is clearly at less than half, which would be 2.5. So if I roll a 1 or a 2, that last model, which will be the sergeant, will also run. Well, I rolled a 1, so he would actually run too. Now that's pretty rare for Space Marines because they get to re-roll stuff, but let's just forget that for now. Next, we're going to check for these Necron warriors. Well, Necrons have a pretty beefy leadership, as you see right here. They have a leadership of 10. They've lost 5 models, so I'm going to have to roll a 6 for them to fail as well. So let's do the roll, and then let's modify it to actually be a 6 so we can see what happens with multiple models left. So the first thing that happens is 1 model is removed for failing. We just start with that. Then we roll a die for each remaining model. And for every 1, another one will die. Now, since they are, once again, at less than half strength, because they started with 10, then it's going to be 1s and 2s. So we roll 4 dice. We get lucky and don't roll any, so nobody else runs away. But for every 1 or 2 that we rolled, we would pick units that would then be removed. Unit coherency checks. After all morale tests have been taken, we now check to make sure every unit is still in coherency. Now, you might think, well, it's impossible for them not to be because every move you made had to keep them in coherency. Well, the one exception to that is allocating wounds. You could actually have accidentally, or maybe without even a choice, killed models that now leave you out of coherency and you had no way to get back into that. Look at these warriors, for example. Let's say they got a hit and this warrior was removed. Now that would be a pretty foolish decision, but let's just say that that decision was made. Or maybe they didn't have a choice. There was a special rule that let me pick the model instead, which doesn't usually happen. What we then do is we look at any unit that is not in coherency anymore, and we start removing models from that unit until it is in unit coherency. So that means that we'll probably have to remove 3 models from this unit before they're in coherency. Let's see what we would do. We know this is more than 2 inches horizontally away, so we remove a model. Are they in coherency? No, still more than 2 inches away. And we keep removing models. Now the unit is in coherency. So pay very close attention to who you decide to remove from your unit, because you might end up leaving them out of coherency without even thinking about it and lose even more models at the end. And that's it. That's all you have to worry about. Well, I know that was a lot, and there's still more special rules and how you build armies and how you interact with terrain and all sorts of other things, but baby steps. Let's just go through this baby steps. Once you've learned the basics, you can add on those special rules. And really the game is not as complicated as it looks once you just kind of add on each building block. I'm not going to say it's super simple. Obviously, there is a lot to it. But that gets us through the second half of a player turn. Once you finish the morale phase, then the battle round ends if both players have gone. If both players have not gone, then the other player gets to go. And the battle continues unless you're done the last turn, in which case you count up your victory points and pack up your models. So that's a lot right there. So we've created a special battle report for you in the MiniWarGaming Vault at the link below that'll show you all these things in action. You'll see shooting, you'll see charging, you'll see fighting, all these things, so you can see it in action, back and forth. And it's specifically designed for beginners, just like the other ones have been, so we'll explain everything along the way. We're going to super explain everything much more than we would in a normal battle report, because it would just make the battle reports drag on a little longer for our normal tactical battle reports that we like to play. So go check that out now so that you can cement all these rules even more in your head. If you're not a Vault member, please consider becoming one. It's what supports us. Vault members are, quite frankly, why we exist. If we removed all of them, we wouldn't have a MiniWarGaming business whatsoever. We might be able to survive with one person making battle reports from their basement, but we wouldn't be able to have our studios and models and terrain and all the wonderful things that we're able to do. So thank you so much to our Vault members for supporting us. If you're not sure if you want to be a Vault member, well, we got a free 7-day trial for you to try out, so there's really no reason not to try. Click the link, get a free 7-day trial, watch that battle report and all the other ones in there, and decide for yourself if you want to support us. Stay tuned for more How to Play Warhammer 40k 9th Edition, Happy wargaming.